Welcome once again to Lehto's Law. Here's Steve Lehto.
Thomas tipped me off to a story in Newsweek, and we often hear about people who spent time in prison for a crime they didn't commit, and they get released. And the question always is, when they get out, do they get something? Do they get compensated? Some states, they have automatic compensation. You spent time in prison, you didn't deserve to be there, you just apply for it and you get it. Other states, you got to file a lawsuit for it. Some states say you can't sue us and you can't be compensated. It just depends on what state you're in. So in Florida, an exonerated man who spent 37 years in prison has been denied compensation for the wrongful conviction. Now, Justin Clowens wrote the story, and the Florida man was wrongfully convicted of very serious crimes, including murder. He's been denied compensation for 37 years he spent in prison. 37 years spent in prison. He's now 55. He was released from prison in 2020, and he'd been behind bars since 1985. However, he'd previously been to prison for nonviolent offenses, and according to Florida state law, anyone applying for prison compensation is required to have a clean record from before they were in prison. Clean record. Since his release from prison, he's been appealing to various Florida politicians to try to have the law waived. His story caught the attention of a state senator who has filed legislation that would allow the man to bypass the law. That politician said, "It's an incredible story. We've taken a portion of their lives as a state, then they should be compensated for that wrongful conviction." Florida state law sets compensation for wrongful convictions at $50,000 annually, meaning that this man would get $1.85 million in damages if he was eligible for it, but he's not. Beyond the compensation, the legislation the politician is proposing would also provide people like him with 120 hours of free education at a state or trade school. And again, that sounds like a good idea. Now, he's met with a number of other Florida lawmakers, and he has explained how he'd spent the year since his release assisting the homeless and completing odd jobs as a handyman. If the law were to be waived, it would not be the first time. So there's some precedent here. A man from Jacksonville in 2020 received $2 million in compensation after spending 43 years in prison, and that's despite the fact that he had a prior conviction. So the man in this case had been arrested for the crimes that sent him away in 1983. There was minimal physical evidence linking him to the crime, but he was found guilty and originally sentenced to death by a Florida state judge. After 3 years on death row, the Florida Supreme Court commuted his sentence to life in prison. But the Innocence Project stepped in and was helping him, and they were able to uncover new DNA evidence that proved his innocence. And I was talking about this topic a couple weeks ago, and someone commented underneath the video because I had said, what's odd is after a conviction takes place, prosecutors will often oppose DNA testing, especially because the technology has changed. So there have been cases from the 1980s, 1990s, where they saved evidence from a crime that they couldn't test for DNA back then, but they could now. And the defendants say, hey, let's test it for DNA, see what it shows us. And prosecutions object to that. Prosecutors object to that strenuously. And I've always said, why would they object to that strenuously when you realize that all it's going to do is help us find the truth? And a commenter said, Steve, DNA doesn't prove anything. It doesn't prove anything. He goes, so you found some DNA, so what? Well, it often does prove something. And so there are crimes where a defendant's DNA would be left behind if they were there. So to give you an example, let's suppose that a crime occurred where somebody broke into a house, and as they broke into the house, they actually injured themselves climbing through a window, and there were droplets of blood on the floor. And then they committed a crime in the house and left. And everyone agrees that the blood on the floor belongs to the defendant. And in the old days, doing dumb pre-DNA testing, and by dumb I mean it just simply doesn't reveal that much, they said, yeah, this blood is the same blood type as the defendant. And he gets convicted. And fast forward so many years, and let's assume that they've actually got a sample that can be tested. We could test the sample today and see by DNA if it matches perfectly with the defendant. That wouldn't prove anything to you? Really? I don't want you on my jury if you really disbelieve science to that extent. So There are examples of things where DNA goes a long way towards proving something. So they find strands of hair at a crime scene that they believe belong to the defendant. I've seen cases before where in the old days they would say this hair that we found, literally a hair, is consistent with the hair we took from the defendant. It's consistent with that. Therefore, convict the man. Man gets convicted. Years later, DNA testing, it's not his hair. You know what it belongs to? Another guy who's in prison right now for a similar crime. Who was out back then, he's in prison now. Oops, wrong guy. That doesn't convince you? Okay, again, I don't want you on my jury. To walk out of this nightmare and hug my mother and sister after almost 4 decades, knowing I was innocent is bittersweet, the man said at the time of his release. I'm grateful to be here, now with a chance to move forward, but I know there are more innocent people like me still behind bars. The Innocence Project is estimated that up to 20,000 people in the U.S. prison system have been falsely convicted, and about 3,000 have been fully exonerated in court. They're approaching the number of 3,000. Wrongful convictions erode the foundation of our justice system. For 37 years, we've had an innocent man locked up in prison, while the real perpetrator was never held accountable for this heinous crime, the Innocence Project said. So it's a crazy story, and it looks like he might be able to get this worked out where he can get the money. They've done it before, but like I said, every state's got different rules in this. And I also have different levels of sympathy because there are situations where it's not an overzealous prosecutor and it's not an ignorant jury. It's just a case where you can see how it could happen that someone got convicted. And so let's just assume that somebody looked a lot like the defendant and happened to be in the area. And somebody said, here's what the guy looked like. And they picked somebody up and eyewitnesses are all, yep, that's him, that's him, that's him. That's happened. That has happened. And it wasn't him. Just looks a lot like the defendant. Looks a lot like the actual perpetrator. That's something that can happen. But we've also heard of cases where prosecutors withheld evidence to get a conviction or contorted evidence to get a conviction, and so on. And those are the cases where the state and actors or agents of the state actually did something wrong to put somebody away. So if you're in a state that does not allow any compensation whatsoever for somebody who spends time in prison, I have an issue with that. Because if it can be shown that a prosecutor put someone away knowing they were innocent, there should be compensation for that. There should be. Now, if you show me a case where the case against this guy was pretty rock solid, and it just turns out it wasn't him, but it was a real weird fluke, 1 in a million kind of thing, that's not as bad as the guy who was completely innocent, like the other guy, but they either created evidence or withheld evidence or did something to get a conviction knowing the guy was innocent and didn't belong in prison. So I know that's a distinction that a lot of people want to say, Steve, if you're innocent, you don't belong in prison. I agree. But the question is, what are you being compensated for? And to me, a person who is innocent and the prosecution knew they're innocent and put him in prison deserves more, or at least their case is much stronger to me than the person who simply got convicted due to bad luck, bad timing, wrong place, wrong time, that kind of thing. So it's an interesting story out of Florida, Thomas. Thank you for sending it to me. Newsweek and others covered it, but an exonerated man who spent 37 years in prison denied compensation for wrongful conviction. He's out now, that's the good news, but he's having kind of a hard time getting his life restarted, and I understand that. Questions or comments, put them below. Let's talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching Lehto's Law. If you're not lost, you're not much of an explorer.